Hello there, this is another book review, this time on Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. This book was a fascinating read. One of the main things I took from the book was a much greater sense of optimism, which at the time seemed to me to be quite profound in a sense, because we're kind of saturated by bad news on the television, in the newspapers. But the main point that Steven Pinker makes in this book is that the world is getting better. It has continuously got better since the Enlightenment era, which took place in Western Europe in the 17th century, 17th and 18th centuries, and will continue to do so. And he makes or sets out to make an objective case of how this is, in a sense, undeniable, because he puts forward a number of ways to measure progress. For example, life expectancy is the most obvious. And in the book, he puts forward a number of graphs, a number of data sets, which demonstrate, I would say beyond reasonable doubt, that progress is continuing to be made, and made very strongly. So let me show you this graph. So this is a graph of life expectancy. I think today life expectancy in Western Europe is actually over 80 now, and for much of human history, people were expected to live until around 30. So that is a very obvious example of how progress has been made. The reasons for that are multiple. They include improvements in medicine, in food, in hygiene, in working conditions. He puts forward a number of discoveries which were instrumental in bringing about progress. And the combined effects of these little improvements are colossal. They really add up over time. One of the points he makes in the book is that progress takes place due to the compounding effects of little innovations. So here you can see, for example, the chlorination of water, the eradication of smallpox, a number of other vaccines, penicillin, obviously a huge deal. Nowadays, if we get an infection, we can just go to the pharmacist, and these drugs are readily available. So we don't actually worry about these things too much, but these really were life and death for everyone in the world until very recently. And these scientific discoveries and improvements have colossally improved the human condition. He talks about the number of deaths. These are the number of childhood deaths from infectious disease, and you can see they're all moving downwards. He displays a number of graphs in this book. He talks about the number of calories, so humans eating more calories. Of course, in the world today, obesity is a bigger problem than starvation. So the problem of not having enough food has been completely flipped on its head due to farming practices improving. Fertilizers have all led to an abundance of food, which has created the opposite problem. Now we have an issue with people eating too much. And of course, when you consider how different and how transformative that simple thing is, we take it for granted, the fact that we can just walk into a Tesco or a Sainsbury's and you have a huge number and variety of different foods that you can buy, all relatively cheaply. But for the entire history of our species, getting food was a huge problem. Majority of history, people were hungry. And until very recently, many people starved to death. And now that's almost completely gone. Well, it has pretty much completely gone. And we live in a time when food is everywhere and it's abundant. So that's certainly a positive. Now, he also goes into undernourishment. You can see the trends are going down. You can see famines all going down, pretty much eradicated now. Once again, owing to technology. This is an amazing graph. Now, this graph represents human prosperity, almost human wealth. And you can see there that pretty much for the entire history since the year 1 AD, human beings were poor as a whole. Obviously there is inequality within that. The kings of Europe and so on lived lives of relative luxury, but everyone was a lot poorer. Even the poorest today probably lived better lives than King Louis XIII of France, you know, because if you look at this graph, huge progress in the last 150 years as a result of the Industrial Revolution and world trade, which has greatly caused a proliferation of productivity. GDP per capita has also improved. So one of the criticisms a lot of people make of the modern world is that wealth is vastly unequal and it's distributed mostly in the top 1%, and that's often a criticism people make. Steven Pinker does mention in the book that one of the major trends of the 20th century is how the improvements of the poorest, the improvements to the conditions of the poorest have improved the most, and how more so than ever the wealthy, through social welfare and government spending, give more to the poor. And the improvements to education, the improvements in housing conditions have never been more generous. People have never been more generous towards the poor in democratic countries, and he says this has been a general trend which has taken place and is a part of what naturally happens when countries get richer. They become more generous to the poorest in society. So although there's still you know, a lot of inequality, the conditions for everyone are improving. And those differences from here to say here, although the difference might be greater, the quality of life going from here to here for the poorest is much, much, much greater. And we should be celebrating those achievements. I certainly think we should. So that's another example of progress. Let me see if I can just show you a number of other graphs. Which may help to indicate, so this is poverty. You can see there, poverty. Let me see if this is worldwide. Oh no, this is in the US. But the trend for the world would be similar. You can see that poverty is in steep decline. He does have a graph for the world as well. Let me see if I can find that. In fact, it's a steeper curve than that from memory. Yeah, you can see here. So this is extreme poverty. All of these graphs, by the way, you can easily find online. If you go to Our World in Data, just go to Google, type in Our World in Data, you can bring up lots of fascinating graphs, and I've spent hours on there going through these data sets, because the picture you get is a very optimistic one, because on all of these fronts we're continuing to make enormous progress. And it's important to remember that, I think, because there's a lot of doom and gloom, but actually things are getting better. and that's not a subjective statement necessarily, because progress can be measured. And certainly if you look at the measures that Steven Pinker talks about, then it's hard to argue against his hypothesis that progress is continuing to be made. So that should hopefully give you a flavour of the book. He does talk about, very briefly, he doesn't go into a lot of detail about what the Enlightenment was. So the Enlightenment, as he sees it, involves primarily the elevation of reason, which took place in the 17th and 18th centuries in Western Europe. He doesn't go into huge detail regarding of where that elevation came from, although there are videos on YouTube that you can watch where he discusses and debates that particular question with a number of other different philosophers. So others have kind of attributed it to the Reformation and what that represented regarding a move towards the individual finding out for themselves and thinking for themselves and believing that the world is intelligible. A large part of this is due to the invention of the printing press. So the printing press was invented in the late 15th century, I believe, and what this meant was that the Bible, for example, Martin Luther translates the Bible into German, and people could access many more books, literacy improves, and they don't necessarily need someone to read to them, because before this the texts, the Bible, for example, was in Latin. And after this invention of the printing press, people could read the Bible for themselves in German, in French, in English. And this, some have argued, led to the Enlightenment, because for the first time, the individual didn't necessarily need a mediator, but could just directly find or think about or come to their own conclusions themselves. And so you can see the seeds of this transition towards I think, therefore I am, Descartes' famous his conclusion that he came to regarding what is true or not. So you can see the development of the Enlightenment in previous centuries. This book isn't really about that. Steven Pinker doesn't go into detail, but you can watch debates and discussions on YouTube, which are fascinating to learn more about how this came about. But with the elevation of reason, the primacy of the scientific method as being the main tool for finding out how the universe works, obviously leads to a huge number of other inventions and discoveries, which, when compounded, result in incredible progress. And this, looking back, certainly is the story of the last 300 years. And Steven Pinker very much sees this as continuing, has criticised some recent trends, which he sees as somewhat not moving in his view in the right direction, but he more or less sees them as temporary issues that will be solved with the application of human rationality and problem solving. So the main take is that it's a very optimistic book, and in times like we're living through now, when there is a lot of problems in the world, I think it's fair to say, this book will be medicine to a lot of the doom and gloom that's about. So the book is Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, humanism, and progress.